Welcome back. This is the Weekend Report. I'm Masachaba Mposwa. As South Africa commemorates Human Rights Day, the right to water and sanitation remains a fundamental part of the Bill of Rights. Enshrined in Chapter 2 of the Constitution, it states that everyone has the right to sufficient water and sanitation. This right is enforced through the Water Services Act, which places a duty on all levels of government to provide water and sanitation services in an efficient, equitable, sustainable, and safe manner. However, in recent years, the country has struggled with a deteriorating water provision system due to various challenges. Let's discuss this and more now with WaterCan Executive Manager Dr. Farriel and Wits Environmental and Sustainability Law Professor Tracy-Lynn Field. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
Good morning, Doctor. Very well, thank you.
Good morning, Masachaba. Thank you for having us on your show.
Welcome to Newzroom Afrika. Dr. Adam, let me start with you. As we continue with our Human Rights Day talk, what progress has WaterCan made in ensuring equitable access to water and sanitation, particularly for marginalized communities?
So I think what we've done is we're building a network of citizen science activists. And what that has done is it's allowed people on the ground to be able to test their own water. Because what we found, Masachaba, is that if someone says, something's wrong with my water, I drink it, I feel sick, the municipality is like, no, it's because you didn't wash your hands or it's your vegetables or whatever. With our testing kit, they are able to then take their results and show it to the municipality and say, actually, it's our water. So it's empowered them to be able to negotiate and be able to talk to municipalities and highlight. And so they can't be gaslit or gaslit, what's the past tense? Anymore, because because so their lived experience has been given energy. It's been given, it's real, and it's been shown that municipalities actually have to be listening to them now when they show with their water tests that there's something wrong with their water. So we've been able to do that in a number of municipalities across South Africa, and the number of activist citizen scientists are growing in terms of holding municipalities accountable for the bad water that they're getting. But also, because we've built that network, there's now another network that's doing two other things. One is spotting the water tanks when they're coming. The other is making sure that the water tanks are doing the right things, not charging people, because we know that that's also happening, but also when there's no water. So those are important things. It's created this active citizenry around water, which we didn't have before. And it all started with the citizen science testing kit.
Professor Field, as an expert in environmental and sustainability law, what are some of the key findings from your research on the state of water services in South Africa, and how do these inform your perspective on the issue?
Thank you so much. So the main project that I'm working on is called the South African Water Justice Tracker, which is a joint project with the Human Rights Commission. And essentially what we're aiming to do is to provide a profile of every single water service authority in South Africa. There are about 144. And we are synthesizing the available information per water service authority. So there's actually an incredible amount of information out there. You know, the Blue Drop report that the Department of Water and Sanitation has published. There is an incredible amount of valuable information, but it's very complex, it's very technical. What we're aiming at doing is to develop a kind of story services with various indicators for every water service authority, and that is eventually going to be available on a GIS-based database that ordinary people can access and find out, what is the bylaw, what is the water services development plan, and so on. So that's what we're doing. We've also been engaging with officials from water service authorities. We've done 7 provinces so far. And in that engagement, we've come to realize some of the really systemic issues. So I'll just mention 2. So the one real issue that officials grapple with is the kind of tension between servicing the existing infrastructure, which is their revenue base, where they get the money to actually, maintain the infrastructure to provide water, versus providing new services. And for the new services, they might not be assured of revenue. So it's this tension between kind of existing infrastructure versus new infrastructure. Then another issue, another piece of the puzzle is really the funding model for water services. Department of Water and Sanitation is wanting to bring in a licensing requirement, which will force water service authorities to ring fence their monies, because even if they get the revenue, they might not be spending it on water. But even that is not necessarily going to solve the problem, because there might not be enough going in. So there was a great report earlier this week, Tracy Ledger from Parry, talking about City of Johannesburg, how we actually just need to prioritize revenues for water infrastructure, because it affects so many rights. Water affects so many rights, and so we have to get that right.
Yes, and yet, Doctor, I'll bring you in here. I mean, more than 3 decades into democracy, there are still people who have no access to clean running water. They have to rely on rivers. What are some of the underlying issues that need to be addressed to ensure sustainable water supply in South Africa for everyone?
So I think Tracy-Lynn has covered some of it in terms of we need to ring fence funding for infrastructure. But I think that the bottom line is that there was this disconnect between a national government and what they should be doing, and then the local government or municipalities and what they need to be doing. And the challenge is that the municipalities are responsible for supplying water. That's your basic services, right? But if we look at the AG's report, our municipalities are failing completely. And that model is not working. And we need to relook at that model, actually, because it's not supplying what it needs to do. Most of them are claiming to be bankrupt. And that's also where the new kind of city capture is happening, right, with regards to corruption. And not anyone's monitoring that. So I think that's the, if we look at what has happened to our water systems, it's the fact that municipalities for decades have not spent the required funding. That is why we're asking for it to be ring-fenced now on water and sanitation services. So you've had a complete breakdown. So Masachaba, if you think about it, if you don't do any maintenance on your 12,000 kilometers of pipes like in city of Joburg, or 11,000 of sanitation, that is going to just deteriorate. And now what we're dealing with in Joburg is this massive failing infrastructure. So I think the first port of call is the fact that municipalities have not been providing the services they need to provide, and no one's holding them accountable. So that's where I think a lot of our issues have come.
Right. Professor, how do you think the conversation around water services can be reframed to prioritize the needs of the most vulnerable members of society?
Absolutely right. There's a percentage of our population that doesn't have access to water at all, and that should be the very first priority, making sure that those people have access. So I think that it's a whole of government and whole of society response. Farriel has pointed out that in terms of the Constitution, municipalities are responsible, but they can't function properly if the water boards aren't functioning properly, if national government is not doing its bit to protect the water resources. So it's a whole of government response, and we all have to take responsibility for water. We need to become just users of water. I don't feel that water is, for some sectors of society, it's not valued. Very high intensity users are not charged enough for water. We kind of need to reframe water as something incredibly precious. In our country, 98% of the water is allocated. We are in a very precarious situation with our water. We have to value water so much highly. And then it's not just a basic need, it's required for dignity, it's required for flourishing. We kind of also need to shift away from just the basic needs narrative. It's required for flourishing and for being, the fullest sense, realizing all your rights.
All right. And Doctor, you had mentioned the failure of some municipalities to provide this very basic need. What would you say are some of the challenges that municipalities face in delivering water services, and how can these be addressed?
So the one would be the misallocation of budget, and so mismanagement of funds. But also, I think I mentioned that so let me use Joburg as an example. They get revenue for water, and they get for water and sanitation comes to about 17 billion. But then they only allocate about 1.2 to Joburg Water that must be used for capital expenditure. That is for fixing, for replacing. And that's definitely not enough. So it's that kind of, they're not allocating the right amount of budget for water. And I think what Tracy-Lynn has said is that if we can fix our water systems, it kind of then fixes everything else. The fact that 25% of our schools don't have running water and 46% of our clinics don't have running water is a complete violation of human rights. So if we try to fix the water system, it helps with education, health, business. So there's this kind of knock-on effect that we have to look at. So in terms of, that is the problem, is that municipalities are throwing their hands up, either that or they putting out to tender and it's corrupt. And we saw that with the tender for the water tanks in Johannesburg of two 20-something-year-olds getting this tender, how they got that without any water tanks in their kind of expertise. So that's the kind of thing we need to watch out for, because as we push for the water systems to be prioritized, for more money to go into it, there is going to be that element that we need to watch out for, which is the corruption, which then damages the whole system.
Professor Field, what are some of the key policy and legislative reforms that you think are needed to ensure that the right to water is realized in South Africa for all?
Thank you, Matachaba. And if I may, there's just one comment I want to make on what Farriel just said. In our engagements with officials, we have come across some municipalities that are really trying and that are really, doing interesting things like real thorough audits. So I sometimes feel like we debate water policy and law in South Africa as if there are only two places, City of Johannesburg and City of Cape Town. We should look beyond a one-size-fits-all solution. I mean, that's the first thing. We've got a country where the precipitation is not equal. Delivering water is not the same in every locality. Some municipalities don't get enough revenue to cover their operational costs. They're different from Joburg. In many rural municipalities, you've got great distances between the district, which is responsible, and then the local municipalities. So I think the first thing, the policy issue, is that realizing it's not one size fits all. And then we have to relook at the revenue model. Since 1994, the policy has been cost recovery and user pays, and that is important because somebody's got to fund the infrastructure. But whether that comes from high-intensity users, whether it comes from a greater share of the equitable share, whether it cannot come from people who cannot pay for water. We need to realize that there's a section of the community. There are, many of the consumers of water are children. We have to be realistic about the revenue base and assure a sustainable flow of funds to maintain that infrastructure and to provide infrastructure for people who've never had access to water services.
Doctor, how do you think the South African government can better fulfill its obligations to provide access to sufficient water and sanitation, as enshrined in the Bill of Rights?
So, I mean, I think as a first port of call, I think that South African government needs to firstly be honest about what they define as access. So if you look at international standards, we would say that 90% of our population has access to clean water, and I think they say 80% have access to safe sanitation. And I think that gives a false sense of what is really going on in South Africa. So the first part for me would be to reconfigure those stats, because then we know the situation, and then we can all act with the kind of this crisis we have in terms of water and sanitation. So that's the first thing. I agree with Tracy-Lynn in terms of it's not a one-size-fits-all, but I do think that governments can, there isn't this priority of actually making sure that people have clean access or access to clean water. We know of areas where they'll put up a Jojo tank, for example, and then leave it there for months. That is not how it works. Also, government needs to realize that they're not divorced from people. So when people on the ground are trying to say, listen, we have an issue in our community, they do not engage. So we need a government that's listening to people and engages better. So yes, there are good municipalities that respond, but there's also many that actually do not, and they don't even listen to people. So communities say, I've written an email, I've tried to contact my ward councillor, they're not listening to us. And I think that's the issue, is that if government keeps thinking that they're going to fix this on their own, we are heading into a bigger disaster.
All right.
We have to have other voices in as well.
Okay. Professor, in closing and just very briefly, what are some of the international best practices that you've observed or that you know of that South Africans or South Africa can learn from in terms of ensuring universal access to clean and safe water?
So, you know, I kind of, to be honest, I don't know that that's the solution, is to look for international best practice. I think that we need to, like Farriel is saying, we need problem-based governance, listening to people, listening to the kinds of solutions they can offer as well. I'll give you an example. So one of the issues that municipalities face is the theft of borehole pumps. And this is a big problem in rural areas where don't have a security company, you can't put up a fence. But in some municipalities, the community has stepped in to provide security. So rather than saying, okay, what's the international best practice? Let's bring it in, let's write more legislation, let's create more institutions. I absolutely agree with Farriel. We need to get to the ground, listen to what people are saying, and co-produce solutions for this problem that is affecting all of us.